they can put you to sleep, and you go to sleep, and 2 weeks later, you don't wake up. But you don't wake up at all. But 2 weeks later, your heart stops. But you can go to sleep for 2 weeks and not have to endure howling anguish and pain or anything like that.
No cancer, nothing.
It's all gone.
Our guest is the one and only Norm Macdonald. Truly, there's nothing like him.
Please welcome one of the funniest guys around, Norm Macdonald.
In the vast world of thousands upon thousands of stand-up comedians who vary greatly in terms of personality, style, political viewpoint, and technique, it is often rare for a, special comedian to come along that can be categorized into a specific tier in terms of ranking that lands them in the category of legendary status, that separates themselves from the herd not only for being a great comic with a unique style who not only produces countless hours of great specials and well-polished material,
very talented actor, nobody funnier, ladies and gentlemen, Norm Macdonald,
but does so in a style that sticks out as uniquely special and increasingly difficult to recreate.
That's when I realized that I was missing a whole bunch of stuff, because I guess at first you think you're good and stuff like that.
No, you are good, and I think that the fact is, really, if you were to look at it in another way, that if people are able to do impersonation of you, that means you have a defined style.
And is not only remembered fondly by their fan base and audiences, but also from their peers.
When Norm was on, did you see when Norm was on?
I watched it when Donald Trump Jr. was on.
That was the best episode of the
What did Norm do with him?
Norm says is the greatest. Norm at one point says,
You, over the years, who are some of the people who have been your go-to people? That I just remember Dave in his early years had Terry Garr and he had Sandra Bernhard.
Yes.
Who are your...
I had so many people. Norm Macdonald was this person who would come, you all know Norm Macdonald, but Norm Macdonald, when we'd have him on in the early days, to this day, I've never interviewed anybody like Norm Macdonald.
The world of comedy in recent years has no doubt had its ups and downs, and of course, and depending on who you ask, has seemed to suffer greatly due to the spiraling climate of outrage culture, Twitter mobs, and political correctness. And being that the world of comedy is so filled to the brim with hacks, mediocrity, comedians who for no reason whatsoever became politically arrogant, who all have an axe to grind.
You're an outspoken fellow, and these are interesting. You're a real loudmouth.
A lot of comedians are super famous and no one can figure out why. It is rare for a comedian to rise to the top who practically is beloved by everyone equally and not only knows their way around a punchline and has more than 3 good hours, but who also brought so many hours of just general happiness to their fan base and audience. And by that I mean, you're having a bad day, maybe you got fired or divorced from your old battle axe wife. Let me turn on this lighthearted podcast and drift away for a while. I'll laugh, clear my mind.
Okay, so here's the joke.
Holocaust denier.
Awesome.
And now that Norm has passed so unexpectedly, I began really thinking about what exactly it is that makes a great stand-up go from the tier of mediocrity to the tier of legendary status. And there truly is a formula to it, and in this video, I want to attempt to explore why that is. Having a successful career telling good jokes might, after all, be only about 30% of the equation of what makes a comedian great. And I believe Norm was far more than just a great stand-up. And I'd go even further as to say that Norm's stand-up isn't necessarily why a lot of people adore this old chunk of coal. Likeability, humbleness, lack of arrogance, timing, and what's different about what you bring to the table as a comedian are all certain pieces of criteria that Norm Macdonald supplied his audience for years. And I hope this video serves as an, tribute or deep exploration of Norm's career and how his death hit us fans so hard, and how unfortunately Norm Macdonald's death marks the end of an era for the fastly fading world of good stand-up comedy. So buckle up do the like and subscribe thing if you do like this video. This is a tribute to the late great Norm Macdonald. So while researching for this video and sifting through hours upon hours of Norm's podcast and stand-up, late-night appearances, the question of who is the greatest comedian became one of the most difficult questions to tackle, mainly because it's one of the hardest questions to quantify, because comedy, after all, is pretty subjective.
No contest. No contest.
Meaning that what you think is funny may differ from someone else's opinion. It's all a matter of taste after all. And comparing legendary comedians to other legendary comedians is very apples and oranges. And to question that is rarely ever agreed upon in the stand-up community. So instead of hyper-focusing on how great Norm was, I figured I'd start out by approaching the subject of how different and how original Norm's comedy truly was.
Oscar Pistorius, even before he... What are you doing?
I have something in my tooth.
Okay,
And it's only when you find a comedian like Norm that has such a distinctive voice, an abstract style of delivery, and a unique personality. If there was one thing that was constantly said about Norm that I learned from watching all the other comedians mourn him, was that Norm was an extremely nice and likable guy.
Hey, Richard, it's Norm Macdonald here. How you doing, man?
And that likability most certainly reflected in his overall humor and stand-up material. And not in a way that made Norm some clean comedian who was afraid to make offensive jokes or made him afraid to step on any toes. It was actually the reverse polar opposite. Norm, especially in a post-outrage era, was absolutely not afraid to go against the grain in a contrarian manner, and actually, when you really start thinking about it, it feels like Norm was one of the only comedians to speak out against certain things. For instance, critiquing the Me Too movement for being a semi-barbaric contradiction to free speech, defending his friend Louis C.K.
Norm Macdonald's become a huge hot topic over his comments about Roseanne and Louis C.K. and the Me Too movement,
and other reasons I'll get into later in this video. But Norm did it in a way that never made it feel like he was grandstanding or virtue signaling. Norm actually usually did the exact opposite of virtue signaling.
I mean, even, like you say, allegations against Michael Jackson, there had to be kids that were like, well, this is pretty cool.
Yeah.
And he never came off as a comedian who had a political or non-political axe to grind with the world.
Terry's not going to give me that. Bush in 2004!
And this is the segment of the video where I want to hypothesize that with comedians, it's not what you do that makes people like you, it's kind of what you don't do. And among a few of the things I personally think a comedian shouldn't do, and mainly because sometimes comedy should be a form of escapism, and being constantly reminded of the political world outside your bedroom is stressful and takes away from comedy, is becoming overtly political, especially when it feels like the only reason you're doing it is to gain Hollywood points, to help your career, just merely to go along with the tide, to get what you think is perceived public opinion on your side. And there are many reasons for a celebrity to make the conscious choice not to ever mention politics. One of the first reasons is obvious. Of course, if you do that, you're going to alienate 50% of your audience who might disagree with you politically. But I always got the feeling that Norm didn't choose to not get political because of that, but instead because he was well aware that, much like the clip I showed before on the WTF podcast, because it takes away from the humor.
So I was like, well, I can't be political.
Right.
You know, I don't know how to do it.
And Mark Maron, for whatever reason on this same episode, decided to go on a random, unhinged political rant, and this is what Norm had to say about it.
You know, that they were like, he's a misogynist. I'm like, she's a pig. She's a politician. Can you name me 2 politicians that command any respect whatsoever? Why do we respect these people? Is it respectable? I don't know. Do you respect a guy that sells you, horse? Yeah, I don't like to get into it that much anymore.
Yeah, let's not get into this, man.
Okay, buddy.
Because it's getting... I can see people not laughing now.
And in the world of stand-up, a lot of comedians that did go the safe route and adjusted their comedy to fit with the climate, I mean, it's kinda hard to blame them, really. It does clearly seem like a lot of comedians had to work their butts off to get to the point of notoriety, grinding for years, doing open mics, building their IMDb portfolio. In post-2010, the tide of Hollywood did seem to be making an obvious turn, where comedy began having a lot of rules tacked onto it, especially post-2016, where political correctness began dictating what comedians could joke about.
We've had a situation where we've been very deep and almost ready to completely book with this individual. Found a clip online where she does a set and there's an off thing about assault, and it was actually the students who said, you know what, no, let's find somebody else.
Everything began getting political, and this led to a lot of comedians not wanting to throw away their career.
So, Howard got you talking about Louis C.K., and I have one question that I don't know if you covered because I was coming into the building.
And instead be a part of the in-group that parrots opinions echoed by the mainstream media. Norm, 100%, did not go that route. Like, at all. In fact, and I haven't been able to verify if this is true or not, but I think it is, what made this Steve Merchant episode of the podcast so hilarious is that apparently Steve said in a former interview that he's completely done answering interview questions that are about hot button or sensitive issues.
You're equal. She's a man that thinks she's a woman. You're a man that thinks you're a man. It's completely
so everyone's,
equal.
it's all fluid.
Yes, everyone is self-identifying.
Yes. And I'm all for that. I think what I felt was I suddenly felt like I was causing offense unwittingly.
And Norm, knowing that, decided to, for an hour and a half, ask Merchant the most controversial and sensitive issues, and Steve is freaking out the whole time, and you can tell by Norm's face he's getting so much enjoyment out of making him squirm, because after all, Norm was a master troll. And another thing I thought was funny on a quick side note was that Conan always loved how Norm would parody the telling a fake story aspect of late night TV and would instead tell old farmer's daughter jokes.
You met Trump recently, is that right?
I met Donald Trump at a
Is this a true story?
Yes.
Or is this one of your, he has a farm and a goat comes by? Because I'm not putting up with that.
Yes.
Oh yeah. I saw Trump. Trump, he had a farm. He said, I want you to meet my donkey, he said.
I love Will Ferrell. I also love Norm Macdonald because he comes on and his stories are all invented. None of them are real. They're all old farmer's daughter's jokes.
In Norm's personal life, besides the fact that he was a deeply closeted gay man gambler, was always kind of drowned in mystery. And of course, Norm released a memoir book about his life, and one night while I was trying to fall asleep, I'd finally purchased the audiobook to learn about Norm's past. And about 40 minutes into it, I realized it was, once again, another huge troll by Norm, who's Canadian, by the way, because he, once again, used his book deal to write page after page about growing up on a farm in a 1930s post-Depression America.
And of course there was old Jack, who to this day is the most unforgettable fellow I've ever met. My father once told me how he had come to be hired. Seems old Jack just showed up one day and asked if there was work to be had. Plenty of work, my father replied.
I'm not sure what I was expecting, but I remember laughing hysterically at what a dedicated troll this was. But to finish my last point about Norm avoiding things that took the humor out of comedy, another admirable thing I've always thought Norm and only a few others have done selflessly is how Norm, in addition to not grandstanding in a virtue-signally political way, was how he never seemed to be a ladder-climbing, career-focused comedian who made selfish, soul-sacrificing decisions for monetary gain or to enrich himself or skyrocket his career. And Norm was never jumping at the chance to star in huge Hollywood movies. In long stretches of his career, he seemed to disappear for long stretches. And when he got a chance to make millions being the voice of the Affleck Duck or pilot TV shows, he wouldn't take it seriously. In fact, it was quite the opposite.
As if I'm looking for something. Fact is, I don't give a fuck if I'm ever in a movie ever.
You don't care about the movie.
Really poor, you don't expect anything of yourself, and you're happy with any measure of success.
Don't you feel successful?
Yes, because I'm not a furnace of ambition or anything where I've met people like when I was at Saturday Night Live, I was just happy to be at Saturday Night Live. When I did my first Letterman, I was happy to do my first Letterman.
I'd say Norm sacrificed his shot at basking in Hollywood's limelight the moment he started saying whatever he wanted, with disregard to who it would offend, was when he started his podcast.
Norm, if you're looking to make it in standard television, you're not going the right route. You're not going the right route.
A lot of fans like myself who weren't particular followers of Norm's early career actually became huge fans of his podcast for the above-mentioned reasons, of Norm's hyper-focusing on making people laugh and leaving political baggage out of the picture, because the podcast carried itself on the notion that Norm was almost mocking the traditional format of podcasting in general.
And you know what? Yeah. Stephen, I'll say this. Not a day goes by I don't think about that fucking old man, how much I hate his fucking guts.
No, I hear you. I hear you. Well, thanks for coming. I don't think we can use that one on the show tonight.
By having hilarious segments making whatever celebrity he felt like interviewing that week read jokes that he wrote but would ultimately blame on his trusty sidekick Adam Egan. And so many people found this refreshing because it truly was escapism in its purest form. It was silly, funny, didn't take itself too seriously.
Well, it's time to do jokes. This is where we put in a big thing, jokes.
So anyway, I just realized this video is getting a little long, so I kind of want to wrap things up while still respecting brevity. So let's segue imperfectly into the conclusion. For many, and especially during the time of stand-up comedy's infancy, you would typically see a comedian you liked, laugh a few times, and the significance of the impact they had on your life was usually very minuscule. And a career like Norm's come around only once in a blue moon, and not only make you laugh the odd few times, but become a soothing way, in the form of stand-up as well as a podcast, to tune in, drop out, relax, and have a good many laughs. And looking back, you almost want to personally thank Norm for all the memories and happiness he gave you over the years. I truly haven't seen a comedic phenomenon so bingeable and rewatchable like Norm Macdonald live, and with such a large dedicated fan base since the days of the Ricky Gervais Show and Carl Pilkington. And not only that, but an awesome inclusive fan base as well, who all share the love of Norm Macdonald equally. Whenever you see a comment on an unrelated video of a Norm quote like, "You know, with Hitler..."
The more I learn about that guy, the more I don't care for him.
You always laugh because you immediately picture Norm saying it. This anecdote is personal for me, but once Louis went down in 2017, who I happen to also be making a video about if you do feel like subscribing, I felt really shattered and really didn't have a favorite comedian anymore, and was growing tired of the fastly rising fame of the LA comedians in the Joe Rogan machine inner circle that I just didn't really like that much. But upon discovering Norm Macdonald live, I became obsessed with binging all of them immediately, and it's now become one of those things for me, and a lot of other people, to put on merely out of habit when trying to fall asleep at night. Norm was unapologetically himself, a master of his craft, and not only that, sort of stand-up comedy's blue-collar seeming everyman. Someone you feel like you could call up to have a quick chat anytime, or someone who would have a conversation with you if you did run into him on the street. And not only was he hilarious, some people, and especially when impersonating him, chalked Norm up to a silly guy who always had a sardonic smile on his face who made silly abstract jokes. But it's clear from other more serious interviews that Norm was a highly intelligent, thoughtful person.
If something is true, it is not sentimental, and I say in truth, I love you.
So the praise and nods this man is getting from other giants in the stand-up industry.
And then last week I got a text, and it just said, I love you. And I didn't say much back. I just said, I love you, Norm. And that was my last communication with him.
It's clear evidence that when we lost Norm on September 14th of 2021, we all lost a close friend dear to our hearts. There will never be another stand-up like Norm Macdonald, and his death, sadly, came at a time where time seems so uncertain for the world and the future of the industry of comedy, and like I said, marks the end of an era. And I made this video not only to point out how great of a comedian Norm was, but for so many out there, specifically, this is how Norm Macdonald brought happiness to millions.
Very funny, Norm, and thank you.
I'm just a whole chunk of coal. I'm gonna be a diamond. That's why I love that.
Good night, everybody.
That movie, The Elephant Man?
Yeah.
We were just talking about it backstage, and I always thought it was a stupid movie.
Right.
Because I always thought it was stupid. Like, the guy doesn't even hardly look like an elephant. So why would
You would be the worst movie critic in the world.
And there's nothing redeeming about the guy. I tell the guys, I go, how on earth could these Germans, follow this lunatic, And they're like, oh, he was an incredible public speaker, He could hypnotize you with his public speaking. And then I see him, he's like, I go, what?
Very talented actor. Nobody funnier. Ladies and gentlemen, Norm Macdonald. Norm Macdonald.